Those of you who've been following the channel for a while may remember that when I lived in Alberta several years ago, I was set to attend the Alberta Homeschool Conference where Ken Ham and the Answers in Genesis Canada folks were going to be speaking and selling materials. And we had a bit of a conflict. We had a bit of a situation, shall we say. But that's all. Bygones be bygones. It's in the past. But Calvin Smith, the gentleman who called me, left a message on my cell phone to let me know that I was disinvited from some events. Anyhow, this is the first time I think I've had Calvin on my channel, so we are going to see what he has to say regarding the Bible and science.
Millions of years into the Bible, trying to add millions of years into the Bible destroys the concept of biblical authority. Now, let me put it
right off the bat. Big claim. Trying to look at science in the Bible destroys biblical authority. Of course, if you are Answers in Genesis, this is absolutely what you believe. However, millions of Christians around the world are able to separate science and the Bible. In fact, even the congregation that I attended, the denomination that I was a part of, part of what we said about inerrancy, and a lot of churches are like this, and I think a lot of people are like this, the Bible is inerrant in all that it intends to teach or in all that it intends to say. And a lot of people would say the Bible is not a science book. The Bible is not intended to teach us science. The Bible is intended to teach us about theology and teach us about God and perhaps teach us about history, depending on how you're looking at it. Anyway, big, bold statement by Calvin. Us versus them, setting up a dichotomy.
This way. Here's a question I like to ask Christians that believe in millions of years and the whole secular geologic timescale. Can you tell me your top
secular geological timescale? Of course, geological timescale was not developed secularly. It was developed through science. Many Christians, many people of other religions, for example, all accept geological timescale. So even just flavoring it as the secular geological timescale is another us versus them, Answers in Genesis versus Christians. And by the way, that's what this whole video is about. It's not for me. It's not for atheists. But I'm still, as a former Christian and a former young earth creationist, these hit home, and I like to talk about them.
3 Bible verses that convinced you that God used millions of years to create?
Can you give me 3 Bible verses that convinced you that God used millions of years to create? So that's his gotcha question, as if you should be using everything from the Bible. But can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me that the moon orbits the earth? Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me the atomic weight of gold? Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me that the wolves are canines? These are questions that the Bible is not attempting to answer. Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me how many planets there are orbiting our sun? These are just, again, category error. I think if I was a Christian, I would be rather offended by this, that the only knowledge that we can have of anything is from the Bible, and clearly that's not the intent.
There's usually a lot of crickets going on at that point because it's usually not the Bible at all that brought them to that conclusion. It's the influence of secular teaching that has brought them to try to fit these ideas into the Bible when they really aren't there at all.
Nope, not the influence of secular teaching, the influence of discoveries about the natural world. Now, when you are a Christian, most Christians believe in 2 types of revelation. They believe in the revelation of the Bible, direct revelation, but they also believe in natural revelation. They believe that the natural order is, in and of itself, part of what God is telling us about himself. Look at the trees. So when you are a Christian, you can't put one book above the other. You don't put nature above the Bible, and you don't put Bible above nature. If God is true, those 2 things will harmonize, right? And so when you discover something in the natural revelation, you need to harmonize it in much the same way as if you have 2 Bible verses that seem to contradict. You need to figure out how to harmonize those 2 things. Is it grace or is it faith which saves us? Well, we need to figure that out. We need to come up with ways to reconcile those things. So our observation of geological time is part of our input by which we evaluate the revelation in the Bible. That's just always been the case.
Now look, when scientists say that events and processes happen in a kind of a vastly different time scale than the Bible records, some people just deal with this by putting, well, that's scientific arguments over here and biblical information over here, different.
That is, I do think that's true. I think a lot of people do that. They say, well, the Bible says one thing, nature says other thing. I'm just going to have cognitive dissonance or just ignore one or the other. That's fine. But there are millions of Christians who look at the geological column, they look at the geological time frames and all the evidence there, and they don't see any conflict. It's about interpretation of one or the other. You don't have to put them in separate boxes, though perhaps you should.
Categories. This is science and this is the Bible. But in the minds of many, and especially our young people in school, science, because it's considered authoritative about the real world, is what is trusted about history and about nature. And because of this, science is usually treated as objectively true, while biblical concepts, well, they become kind of thought of as subjectively true. And
Well, this is perhaps appropriate. So when you're talking about something being objectively true, that means that you have something external to a entity or a mind that you can evaluate the claims against. That is not subjective, is literally it's of the subject. Now, when we look at science, science is evaluated by how well it makes predictions about the real world, about the natural world. And that is absolutely an objective standard, because it's not up to me or Calvin or any of you watching to independently decide at what temperature water boils at sea level. That's a purely objective external thing that can be evaluated. So in this sense, science absolutely is objective, and if the Bible is not making claims that have predictive power, for example, it is. And if you're using it to evaluate how you should live your life, that is absolutely, interpretation is a subjective standard about you as a subject. In this way, absolutely, one is objective and one is subjective. Science, while there is interpretation in some of the results of science, the observations themselves, the observation that it is 100 degrees Celsius when water boils at sea level, that observation is not subjective.
When biblical concepts are treated as subjective, they can easily be dismissed as unimportant, but they're not.
They're not what? They're not easily dismissed, or they're not unimportant, or both. I don't know, or they're not subjective, perhaps all three. I actually agree that at some point when you are looking at the Bible purely as allegory and purely as advice and all those kind of things, the way some people look at the Bible, it can be easily dismissed. It does need to have some objective validation for me to be taking it seriously and to weighing it into my factors of my life. Absolutely, Calvin.
Now, we'll cover the difference between operation and historical, or what we call origin science, in another episode. But for now, let's just remember that origin science represent one-time, unrepeatable events, and here, the usual, scientific methods from experimental science just don't apply.
That's wrong. So one of the things that Answers in Genesis likes to hang their hat on is that the definition of science is observable and repeatable. But the scientific method is obviously not one single thing, but in general, science wants to make predictions about the future. That's why it's useful to us. That's why we can launch space shuttles and have a cell phone and cure disease or treat disease, because science allows us to make predictions about the future. It is not entirely about repeatability. So, for example, look, I'll leave some example because he's going to give some. But that science needs to be repeatable to be science is absolute garbage. Science just needs to make predictions.
Understand that there's been a lot of unprovable assumptions made in developing theories about the age of the Earth and events of the past, and there's bias there.
He's not entirely wrong that there are some unprovable assumptions that go into science. Probably the biggest one is the regularity of nature, in that the way the laws of physics that work today have worked that way in the past and will continue to work that way in the future. That is just something we take axiomatically or presuppositionally. Absolutely it is. So we cannot prove that thousands and thousands of years ago that the decay rate of a certain radioisotope was exactly the way it is now. However, the most reasonable assumption seems to be that it was, in that in all the time we've been observing radio decay rates, for example, it has never varied. And unless someone gives us a good reason to think that these kind of things vary, or gravity, or of any other constants, the speed of light, that kind of thing, we are justified in thinking that those things are uniformitarianism or uniformity, until we are shown otherwise, that axiom or that presupposition is no good. And guess what? The second that some of those things can be shown to be changeable, then we will change our presupposition that they don't change. However, we make the best predictions by assuming that they do. That's the main thing. So, of course, the young earth creationists, a lot of time, they want to say things like, the speed of light may have been different in the past, or the decay rates may have been different in the past. All these kind of things that they want to just hang their hat on, well, we can't prove it. Yeah, they're not wrong. So actually, and we as non-believers in some of the young earth creationist stuff should own that some things, like the reliability of our senses, for example, that they're reliable enough, and that we use instruments and other things that, even though those instruments require our senses as well, that we have methods of cross-checking ourselves and doing that kind of thing. Some of these things are presuppositions, but they exist. So let's not be dogmatic and pig-headed and foolish about it. So Calvin's right. Very briefly, we can't prove it, but they are the most reasonable thing to believe.
Based on people's worldview. And we'll get into that in other episodes. But basically, there's a big difference between someone, using science to figure out what water boils at sea level on our planet, through a repeatable experiment, and trying to use historical science to figure out, if it was Mr. Green or Professor Plum who killed the victim in the conservatory with the candlestick. You know where I'm coming from. When no one's...
Okay. So he gave an example there of what he thinks are two different things you can't determine by science. He seems to think that in the real world clue game, you cannot tell if it's Mr. Green who killed in the conservatory with the candlestick via science, because it's not repeatable. However, if it was Mr. Green in the conservatory with the candlestick, you can then make predictions about what kind of observations you will find. So, for example, you may find a candlestick with blood on it, and or the wounds on the victim will be the same measurements and have the same pattern as the candlestick in question that you suspect that he killed them with. Like, these are absolutely observations you can make, and you can repeat these observations. So if you measure that the candlestick is the candelabra part is like 6 inches long, and it has the different striations and different things at different points, you can measure that on the body over and over again. That is the repeatable part. You may also, if it's in the conservatory, you may also predict that there will be possibly blood found there, and that the blood would, if you struck them with a candlestick at a certain point in their body, they would create certain bruises and or spatter patterns if it was in the head, for example. These are all things that you can scientifically determine about events that are not repeatable. These are predictions you can make. Again, if it's Mr. Green, you may predict that there is fingerprints on the candlestick, and or his DNA found at the scene, or evidence that he was at least in the house and in the conservatory. These are all, you get the idea. These are all absolutely scientific predictions you can make about the past, about non-repeatable events. And the same thing is true with origins. We can make predictions if we want to say that all life has a common ancestor. There are certain predictions you can make. You can say, if you want to hypothesize about plate tectonics or the age of the earth, you can make predictions and see if those predictions are found. That's the problem with creationism, is that it does not make unique predictions. There's no unique prediction that is made and found that has been determined and that has come true. So, for example, if you wanted to say that God uniquely created every kind of plant or animal, a unique prediction would actually be that there are certain kinds of animals that don't necessarily share any DNA with other creatures, right? Because God could create a special species of, say, even a platypus, right? Like, that's often a common example. It was so weird. Why does a platypus absolutely share the DNA that we would predict from the ancestors we would predict in the clades that they are in? Why are there not creatures that don't share? Like, that would disprove evolution, right? If we suddenly found that a bunch of kinds don't share DNA. So it's creation science that fails the science test.
Saw it happen, and you can't repeat the experiment. Anyway, if the Bible isn't true to the facts about the real world, about the age of the earth, and there's no reason for us then to really trust it to explain our everyday human experience, atheists and Bible skeptics realize this, and they say, well, many Christians are contradicting their own beliefs by questioning teachings in the Bible itself, especially.
This is not entirely wrong either. While millions of Christians are able to harmonize the science of old earth and perhaps biological evolution, then they can reconcile that with what they read in the Bible. It seems to me that is not the most natural, most honest way of reading these texts. Now, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an expert. It is not the reason why I am not a Christian. There's lots of other reasons, although it did prompt me on my journey to look. But I'm actually kind of with Calvin. If you are going to broadly just allegorize, for example, Genesis 1 and 2, to such an extent that it doesn't matter that the order of creation was wrong or that you have to accept all kinds of weird stories, that it's not meant to be taken literally, just meant to be taken allegorically. I feel like it is pretty easy then to start wondering, at what point do we stop allegorizing, and at what point do we stop taking these things as actual history? These are good questions to ask. And I think if you want to be a believer or not a believer, these are something you should wrestle with.
Genesis, and this is often used to attack the entire Christian faith. Look, I've dialogued with a lot of believers over the years at conferences and different events, etc., and I've experienced something repeatedly. The conversation usually looks, something like this. Well, look, I'm a Christian, but look, I'm a well-educated person, and I believe in science and millions of years and evolution, and I've got a couple of degrees, and I don't want my family and friends to think I'm some naive, unintelligent Christian, I mean, of course, Genesis is just mythological. Look, it's got a talking snake in it. Yeah, well, the problem with arguing this way is that if you look over here in the Bible, there's a talking donkey. And over here, there's a floating axe head. I mean, how's that experiment going for you? Do axe heads float? And over here, there's...
These are excellent points. And that is partially why I wonder why ministries like Young Earth Creation Ministries like Answers in Genesis bother at all to try to give the appearance that they are scientific. So Calvin was just complaining about someone he spoke to, or a stereotype of someone he spoke to, that they're Christians and they want to seem academic. Is not Answers in Genesis trying to take that Genesis 1 and 2 and make it seem academic? Why are you not just embracing that? If you're going to embrace miracles of talking donkeys or miracles of floating axe heads, why are you just not saying, look, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is a miracle. We don't attempt to defend it. We don't attempt to explain it. This is all part of God's magic and how he works. Magic's probably not the best phrase. Like, or on the flip side, why is then Answers in Genesis not writing articles about the science of talking donkeys and how giving us demonstrations of how, it is possible with the larynx of a donkey that they can, and with the lips and all these things, why is it not scientifically plausible? Or with the serpent, why are we not giving us Answers in Genesis telling us the science about floating axe heads? Why, Calvin, are you selectively saying that's fine to be miracles over here, but Genesis 1 and 2 we need to try and defend? I put forth that it is you who are attempting to defend academic prowess, and that you are not silly believers who believe for bad reasons. Your whole ministry, your parent ministry, everything you're doing is all to make you Christians not look ridiculous and to feel like you can believe in 6,000 years old with some scientific backing. I think we're looking at projection here. What do you guys think?
It's a guy who walks on water and it's not even frozen, and Jesus is healing a crippled hand and a dead person comes back to life. I mean, which part of the Bible am I supposed to be embarrassed about as a Christian? Non-Christians are...
Yeah. Why is Answers in Genesis embarrassed about the flood and embarrassed about creation to the extent where they have to set up whole streaming services and $100 million attractions to try to just convince people that there are scientific reasons to do this stuff? Huh?
Often looking at believers like, well, why do you believe this part but not this part? Why do you hold to science that they think that's what it is here, but believe that dead people come back to life over here? Why so inconsistent in your thinking? Arguing that way signals to people that what scientists have determined about the past has more authority than what the words of Scripture do. And then why would we expect...
So we've already covered that, but natural revelation and direct revelation should be in harmony, and you don't take one over the other. I think most thoughtful Christians would agree that the God of the Bible, if the God of the Bible is correct, wouldn't lie to us in nature and by conflicting with things. So you absolutely need to take both and harmonize them. And if you can't, the only one we can actually test for its validity is the natural revelation. So if natural revelation conflicts with any reasonable interpretation of this scriptural revelation, guess what? The scriptural revelation has to lose, or it needs to be reinterpreted. That's just the reality here. But to deny reality to save your interpretation of a book is the silly position. Now I'm with you. That undermines the book. And so if you've decided, for the Bible tells me so, if that's the whole reason you believe anything and that's why you just stop defending it, just embrace it all as talking donkeys.
Anyone to take it as authoritative. So why should the age of the earth even matter to Christians? Because trying to add millions of years into the Bible when it's clearly not there destroys the concept of biblical authority.
It doesn't destroy the concept of biblical authority, because obviously there are people who interpret the Bible and believe in it very much, and they believe the Bible is authoritative in their life, and the Bible is authoritative in that which it attempts to teach. What the people would say is that the Bible isn't attempting to teach us actually about origins or about science or about these kind of things. And so anyway, how do you guys reconcile this stuff? Was science, for those of you who no longer believe, was science a part of that journey for you? As it was the start for me. It was not the nail in the coffin, as it were. Or perhaps are you still a Christian? How do you reconcile conflicts between general revelation and direct revelation like the Bible? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you agree that the Bible, there are different magistrates and that the Bible is not attempting to teach at all about science. Well, let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat, or let me know in the super chat. That'd be great too. All right. That was Calvin Smith of Answers in Genesis.